of happiness, March 20th. And that happened 12 years ago, but it's going to stay forever. So I love it. I love that we have an excuse and very important date to celebrate happiness as a human right, as a birthright, as a universal goal. And I think that we all agree that International Day of Happiness should be every day. But at least we have one day where we can say, okay, please remember that today is our celebration, and it's not just about uh, respecting my happiness. It's actually, please don't make me unhappy. Please respect that I have the right to be happiness as you do. So with that in mind, we have an amazing topic to cover today. We are going to be focusing on toxic cultures, and we are going to be seeing and we are going to be understanding what it is, why it matters, and what can we do to turn those cultures around and to create environments and spaces where people can really thrive. So with that, and because of that reason, we have what I consider two of the major experts in this space, Jacqui Brassey from the McKinsey Health Institute and Tessa West from New York University. So why don't we introduce ourselves and we basically say why we are here and what do I want to get out of this session. Tessa, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tessa West. I'm a social psychology professor at New York University, and I'm in the business of studying uncomfortable social interactions. So what does that mean? That means everything from asking your boss for a raise, confronting a coworker who you feel like maybe stole your idea or overstepped their boundaries, to interacting with a physician in a doctor's office and trying to get to the bottom of what a diagnosis is. So anytime we're engaging with someone socially and we're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, and we try to do all sorts of things to kind of mitigate that discomfort, including being overly nice to people, that's my business. And I study people's physiology. So I study what us psychologists call below the neck measures of stress, things like your heart rate and your blood pressure, the things that tend to impact our health, but we often can't see. And I also look at people's behavior, which is kind of interesting, are often in conflict to those indicators of stress. The more stressed we are, the more we smile, the nicer we often are. And I bring all this together to understand how we can actually improve uncomfortable interactions, particularly in the context of toxic workplaces. So places where your boss maybe is micromanaging you or even neglecting you, where your coworkers are free riding off of you, these types of things. And I think, as someone who studies health and social interaction, we spend more time at work than we do at home. We spend, more time with our boss, unfortunately, than with our spouse. And the flow of stress tends to go from work to home, even more so than the other way around. And so understanding how we can mitigate these stressors, how we can improve our social interactions, I think is really key, not just for having healthier work lives, but for having healthier physical bodies and just healthier lives all around. And so I'm excited today to talk to Jacqui about the ways that we can get really hands-on and concrete about how to do that.
Wow. Wow. If there is somebody who knows about this topic, it's definitely you, Tessa. And you have an upcoming book. We can talk about your upcoming book soon. But
Sure.
let's go to Jacqui. Jacqui, why are you here? Why are you interested on this topic?
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Tessa. It's delightful to be here again and to now work with you together. We have been meeting each other in different places along the way of the journey. I'm Jacqui Brassey, based in Luxembourg, and a co-leader at the McKinsey Health Institute, where I co-lead employee health and well-being, amongst other things. And the reason why I'm here is that we also have put data behind the topics that we talk about today. We looked at actually the experience of toxic behavior around the world, but also the impact it has on health and well-being in organizational settings. And as Tessa already mentioned, we spend a lot of our time at work. That means workplaces do have an impact and a role to play in mitigating this. But we also know through our research actually that the workplace determines about 50% of the variance in health outcomes, but also 69% of the variance in burnout symptoms. So And toxic behavior is a huge one there. So we will explore that together. But the reason why I'm here is I'm passionate about it. Organizations have a role to play, and our listeners can make all the difference there. And I hope that we can inspire them and give them also some tactical tools to make the world a better place through this topic and this conversation. Thank you.
Well, I really like this combination of what we can bring to the table, because we have the academic world and we have a lot of research behind and practice. We have the analytical, practical, and the wisdom that is always coming from Jacqui and the whole McKinsey Institute. And I bring what I would say the non-for-profit, because the World Happiness Foundation, we are for-purpose organization. But I think my background in the corporate world is being extensive, leading professional services brands worldwide, especially building cultures and branding. So this is something that that we can combine among all three and see what we can get here, because the goal is that we go from what is a toxic culture to what do we do to thrive. So we are going to go and explore the topic from multiple angles, and we really want to bring practical elements to everybody who is listening and being part of this roundtable. So with that in mind, Tessa, can we have the honor of defining what is a toxic culture? How do we define it? How do we see it? How do we feel
This is a great, yeah. So I have a book. What is it? What is toxicity? I have a book called Jerks at Work, Toxic Coworkers and What to Do About Them. And despite the fact that this word is baked into my book title, I have to say that I think it's very difficult to define toxicity. I think one kind of fascinating thing I've learned after writing this book, but mostly after, is that toxicity is often in the eye of the beholder. What one person thinks is toxic is damaging to their self-esteem, to their productivity, to their well-being. Another person would say, you know, that's just the culture here, or that's just how things are done, or why don't you just suck it up? You know, and so there's a lot of wiggle room in how we actually define toxicity. And I think if someone comes to you and says, I have a toxic coworker, the first kind of response often, our instinct is to say, oh my gosh, what a horrible person. Tell me all about that. But the kind of better answer is, let's talk about the behavior that's leading you to make that attribution. Why are you calling that person toxic? What about what's going on do you feel like is toxic? Let's really break this down step by step into what's actually behaviorally going on. And so toxicity is often what we call an attribution, which is a fancy way of saying a word for the inference we make for someone's behavior. We infer when they do something that we don't like, that's disruptive, that there's intent behind it, and that they're trying to be toxic and that they're trying to be disruptive. So it's more a feeling than it is a thing. Toxicity is something that we feel like is around us, but can very much differ from person to person. And so, you know, what I've learned is that there is no one definition of toxicity. It varies from culture to culture. It varies from person to person. And the best way to really get at the heart of whether you have a toxic culture is to break things down into conversations around the specific behaviors underlying why you feel that something is toxic. What is kind of driving that emotional response you're having? And so is there such thing as a toxic person? On the kind of endpoints, sure. In extreme cases, absolutely, where 99% of us would agree, you'd get consensus. But most of the time, it's super fuzzy and ambiguous, and it's actually very difficult to label. And that's kind of one thing I learned. And so people kind of want to be able to label it, but it's actually very hard. And there's some steps you can take to figure it out. But not a super clear answer, but I think a real one that I've learned through my experience as a researcher and also as a consultant in this space.
Yeah, we know that it's not easy, but to define, but I think it's easy to feel it, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you are in a place where you feel you don't belong, I feel, at least for me, it's like, oh, what's going on here?
Yep.
When I was with Deloitte for 12 years, I had to travel all over the world when we had 750 offices. For me, it was so easy to get just to the office and talk to a number of partners there and feel that, okay, it wasn't 100% right, or it was amazing, but it was more a feeling, it was an intuition.
Yep.
But Jacqui, what do we do for people with no intuition? what how do we acknowledge that something is not working in a culture?
Yeah, I love that question. How do we acknowledge something's not working? Actually, I would love to build on Tessa's definition here, looking through the eyes of the employee. Because I have some data, actually. We asked people that question, the subjective experience, because I fully agree with what she just described, that the truth is in the eye of the beholder. And Tessa and I did a podcast and an article on that together as well from McKinsey Health Institute, which is maybe also interesting for the readers. So what we asked basically in our global study, which we did in 30 countries, and we asked 7 questions, which is, we try to keep it as behavior focused, but it is a mix of judgment as well, because it's very difficult, right? If you look through the eye of the beholder and the employee, and we ask questions like, I work with people who belittle me or my ideas, or I work with people who make demeaning or derogatory remarks about me, or my manager puts me down in front of others. And so there are 7 questions. There's one also about I'm verbally abused or threatened by clients, customers, or patients. And these range from quite, from light to quite severe, but all through the experience. And the experience is subjective. What is toxic for one is not toxic for the other. But if you look at this and those 7 questions, then roughly 1 out of 10 really experience the serious level of being ridiculed by managers, and that's heavy impact, right? And then overall, I mean, there are 1 out of 4 that have experienced 1 out of these questions for sure already. So there is something going on, and it is very important to know that this is happening and to understand in an organization what the level is actually by potentially just asking the question and finding out what are, for example, indicators that help us understand if this culture is healthy. And Louise, it's not only about looking at inclusive behaviors, because sometimes companies say, well, but I have a high score on engagement, I have a high score on inclusion, therefore there's no toxic behavior. Not true. We see that they are orthogonal, they can coexist, and often they exist in little pockets. And so getting an understanding about that, it's not easy, but you can, right? You can find it out, and you can look at indicators of what is going on by asking questions in the survey. We have seen reluctance, though, that companies don't want to put a sticker on a toxic questionnaire, but you can call it something else or whatever. The reason is that they don't want to prime, and there's also something to say. So this is about what are behaviors that you do not want to see, how can you ask them, but also ask positive questions, and then see actually what is the pattern, and keep a finger on the pulse, which can be done in different ways. And that at an organizational level is something that you can do. At an individual level, it's another question that goes into adaptability and self-efficacy and individual resilience, which I think we will touch upon. But that's another thing that's part of the solution space, I think, that is very important.
Thank you so much for this insight. This is so so relevant, and is building on Tessa's. Tessa, I was thinking, as I was listening to Jacqui, if you have studied why people behave in a toxic way.
Yep.
So what is behind?
Yeah, I think our first intuition is that they're doing it to take us down. There's a bit of a spotlight effect where we think if someone's targeting us with their toxicity, it's because they see us as competition, or, they want to give us a lesson in how, we should behave here. But 9 times out of 10, I actually think toxic people have no idea that their behavior is this toxic. And it's often coming from the top down. Kind of the classic example of this is middle management, where we see a lot of micromanagement, because middle managers are often promoted into a leadership role, not because they have experience with that, but because they're really good at their old job. And so their instinct, when they're feeling insecure, when they're not actually getting clear leadership training or instruction from their manager, is to do the thing that they used to do really well, which is to oversee your job. Unfortunately, you now hold their old job. And so when we see someone micromanaging us, our instinct is to say something like, they don't trust me, or, they don't know what they're doing. They don't like me. I'm going to hide from this person. Most of the time, it's that person didn't actually get any training. They didn't receive kind of lessons of what it looks like to go from task focused to leadership focused. And that's a huge transition, to think as an individual contributor, to think as a team member. And that's something we don't see a lot. So I'd say, why do people do this? They're often doing it either to fit in, because it's behavior that their boss demands, or that they've simply been kind of, that's how they were trained. You know, kind of the other main reason why we see toxic behavior is because it's just simply they're mimicking the behavior of those around them. This is what others have done to get ahead. And rarely they're actually doing it intentionally to destroy you. And I think removing that attribution is the first important step of having a conversation around that toxic behavior. So you're not going to someone and saying, why are you so toxic? You're going to them and saying, why did you do X? Why did you do this behavior? Let's talk about sort of what was behind that. And I think one kind of fascinating thing I've learned is a lot of so-called toxic people will come to me and they're really upset about the accusation. I had no idea people felt this way around me. In fact, when I asked him and I said, how am I doing? I got a lot of what I call my lab brittle smiles. You're doing so well. You know, you're doing great. And in reality, that's, you know, they're just covering up because of power issues. And so getting to the bottom of it is really hard, and you have to ask very specific behavioral questions. So toxic people are often unaware that they're doing it. No one tells them. People feel uncomfortable opening up, and they're often doing it because this is how they were trained, or they're mimicking the behavior of those around them, or they don't know any better. And so this isn't always the case. I don't want to just bail out all toxic people, but I do think it's important to go through that mental exercise when you encounter someone who's toxic, and think sort of critically about what would they have to gain by intentionally trying to destroy me. Usually the answer is not much. So, you know, so those are just a few of the kind of underlying causes of toxicity.
Wow. So you put it in a way that actually we understand. I love it. There are so many reasons. I always look at the positive intention behind things, because there should be something positive. Yeah, I mean, there is toxic positivity as well in many ways. But
I'm married to a Canadian. I'm very well versed in the world of toxic positivity. Framing everything positively.
Okay, so we have to talk about that as well. But I think somehow what you say, probably there is no match. This is so interesting, because that's a way to put things in, basically in perspective in many ways. What I like to think as well is that there's something intentionally positive, and that might be focused. I mean, that might be based in a trauma, that might be based in a past experience, it might be based on something that is making that person suffer so much that they have to make my life miserable. But even if we understand what is good behind or what is positive behind, then we have to do something. So I don't know, Jacqui, if and maybe we can start moving into transformation. What do you do? I mean, what do we do when we have a situation of toxicity in the culture perspective, understanding the culture? And I love this phrase a lot from Peter Drucker, is basically culture eats a strategy for breakfast. So we can have the best strategy, but culture is going to kill it if we don't take care of it. So what do we do, Jacqui?
Yeah, and culture can eat happiness and well-being, right? It also can build it so there's a very positive thing. I was just reflecting on toxic positivity. I thought maybe the Dutch are actually not so much in the toxic positivity space, because they call a spade a spade. That's where I'm from. And there's also a drawback on that side. So anyway, what to do? So at McKinsey Health Institute, we looked at that as well, and we had lots of conversations with organizations. And one of the things that I remember you asked me as well, Louise, is what do good companies actually do? How do they transform it? The thing is, if you look at, and I have some tactical solutions, but if you look for case studies, of course, there are not really a lot of companies that proudly show how horrible they were on toxic behavior, and then showed how they transformed, because this is a very sensitive topic. But what we looked at, and what we find in a lot of organizations is actually well in place, is primarily the reactive side of things. So you have many organizations have an escalation route. So if as an employee you experience toxic behavior, you can go here and here to actually get help. That is not always optimally used for many reasons, because if people escalate, they still do not always get help. because you do need to have other follow-ups in place as well. And you need to have trained people to help you. But the standard tick in the boxes policies and procedures are very important to have and are very important to take seriously. But that's only one side of the coin. And we can think of all of them. Have an ombud, have somebody to talk to in a safe environment, have a way to escalate it, and have a procedure in place what to do if it's really serious. That's just, the standard procedures. But I personally really would vouch for also the proactive side of things, and looking at what are the values actually that you build into your culture. How do you actually appreciate leadership? What are the behaviors you want people to show? What do you value as an organization? But also, how do you help managers to handle this? How do you equip them? And how do you create an environment that where there's actually space to have difficult conversations? How do you help people to have difficult conversations? What are those skills? And another one, so what do you tolerate? What do you absolutely not tolerate? But another one is also, how do you equip people? I'm a big fan of this, to get adaptability skills. So that's one of the things that I wrote about in Deliberate Calm and Authentic Confidence. Is around building the self-efficacy, but also the skills to have a difficult and tough conversation, but also to process difficult emotions. So even if you go to work with positive intent and you learn how to set positive intent, pressure and work pressure can sometimes turn, can turn us can make it difficult for us to stay calm. So how do you then actually, if you work in a team, how do you make that discussable? How do you make that part of conversations as a team? What went well in our team, what did not went well this week. And Tessa has tons of examples, but it's both the proactive and the reactive side. And how do you follow that up? But also, to start with, how do you actually know where you are as an organization? So that's just a couple of snippets. But I think, Tessa, you have tons of other examples to build on that, because I remember we spoke about that when we last had our conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, this proactive approach, just to kind of build on what Jacqui said, this proactive approach and what we want to see more of is something that we often don't talk about at work. Typically, we handle toxicity, once we're able to detect it, through these tools she talked about, with a whack-a-mole approach. Oh, here's a baddie, I'm going to smash him down, I'm going to punish him, moving on. But most of the time, toxic people are kind of made within a culture. They're not really born, with a few kind of extreme exceptions. And we have to look at sort of what's actually creating this fertile breeding ground for toxicity. What is it about this place that makes toxic behavior really thrive? And this starts at the interview process. What are we signaling? Who are we recruiting? Who are we reaching out to, for those job interviews that could potentially contribute to this culture? And what types of proactive behavior can prevent it? A lot of times we talk about what we want to see less of with people at work, but in feedback conversations, you need to talk about what you want to see more of too. Not something we don't do a ton of. And I'd also say, just building on her points about sort of the difficulty of sort of detecting and treating these things, we need to have feedback conversations, and we need to teach people how to have them. And outside of performance management, once a quarter kind of thing. I'm talking like low-level, daily, behavior-focused, bite-sized feedback conversations that are not about big picture, how are you doing here? How is your performance looking? But small things like, how was that presentation I gave? When I talked to the client, did you feel like I interrupted them too much? Teaching people how to ask for feedback, not just give it, and critically teaching that skill for people to give upward feedback to their managers. And I think managers can do this. They can do it in very small pieces. Kind of one piece I advise a lot of leaders to do, if they're in a culture where feedback isn't normative, or it's overly nice, or people are uncomfortable, is to start with something so mundane that it can't possibly offend anyone. There's no right or wrong answers. And this kind of goes intuition. Shouldn't we focus on the important things? Yeah, eventually, but you got to get people to kind of build that muscle. And so in my lab at NYU, I have, conversations around who should cater lunch and what color we should paint a wall, and, how many new lab coats we should order right now and in what sizes. Pretty mundane things that feel like pretty low level. And I ask for feedback for new members of the team about these kind of small things, just to get them comfortable with the experience of even giving me feedback, and eventually build up to the tougher stuff. And I think a lot of cultures say, God, we have a toxicity problem, we have a feedback problem. I'm going to sit down with my employees and say, how am I doing here? Am I toxic? And you're not going to get honest answers. You really have to build that up. That's like trying to run a marathon if you haven't worked out in 4 years. Bad idea. You really have to work that muscle, and you have to teach people how to give upward feedback, downward feedback, and parallel feedback on their teams. And you need to build those structures in, and you need to advertise this at the job interview stage. So if people are toxic, or they're what I call in one of my chapters, the kiss up, kick downer, they destroy everyone at the same level as them and beneath them, but they kiss the boss's butt. You know, you want to filter those people out at that stage and say, we have a very open feedback conversation here. It goes all different directions. And then they're not going to feel at home in a place like that. So I think these are little steps you can take to kind of actually prevent these things from happening, especially if you've detected them. Don't go level 10. Am I toxic? Start super small to kind of build these conversations. But I'm in the business of studying interpersonal one-on-one interactions, where I see a lot of this stuff get manifested. So my advice is going to often be around changing culture by changing those one-on-one dynamics first.
This reminds me so much of one of the situations that I faced going to Japan. We really had to engage more the Japanese management and basically the employees there, and it was very difficult because of a language issue and a cultural issue. So something that after 3 times I was there, it was super difficult to have meetings where people were able to express their opinions. There was always somebody in the room who was looking at other people, and you felt that it's like, okay, they cannot talk in many ways. And I don't say that this is general. We cannot make a generalization. But what I perceived the first 2-3 times that I was there is that there were a lot of people that were willing to say something. They were not saying anything. So one thing I did was, okay, what can I do here? And actually I work a lot with the assistant of the general manager. She was amazing, and she was giving me some tips about culture in the office. And one day she told me, she was the one who told me, why don't you bring people to karaoke? Because you know, we are very different outside of the office. And I say, okay, sure, let's do this. So we did it. It was so amazing. The vibe and the communications completely changed. So then the following time when I was going to Japan, I always started the meetings with karaoke night. That was the first night before the official meeting in the office. Well, you cannot imagine how the whole dynamic changed, because actually they were absolutely open doing karaoke night. They were talking about their personal life. They were talking about interpersonal relationships. They didn't do this in the office. And in the office, the feeling was that this is not working at all. But actually outside work, it was just spectacular. So that was a practical tip for me, and a really aha moment about how you can change completely the dynamic by bringing something that people love at work. So actually what you said just remind me of something that I did in a practical way. And I don't know if Tessa or Jacqui, you've experienced this before as well in other cultures.
It's a great point. I mean, the concept, the topic universally is relevant to every country, because that's what we see in the data, but the execution of how you change it is different in each country, right? It's very important to contextualize it and to understand the local cultures. I mean, it's a great example, Louise.
I want to add to Louise. I don't even know if you meant to do this, but you know, power and status are everything when it comes to these interactions. And when you're at the top of the hierarchy, it's very easy to forget that everyone's kind of paying attention to your every move, and that they're often going to feel very intimidated when it comes to giving you feedback. And we know from lots of research in social psychology that simply changing the setting can reduce kind of priming some of those power concepts. So a CEO who's sitting behind their giant desk, taking up a lot of space, sort of physically feeling dominant, they're going to have a very different conversation with their direct report than the CEO who decides to go for a walk around the building during that feedback conversation. So simply taking yourself out of the context where all of those power and status roles are primed, super salient, kind of really infiltrating people's minds and, their emotions is really key. And so by bringing people into karaoke, by taking them out of that context, you did a ton for breaking down those status and hierarchy barriers that can actually influence how we communicate. And adding that kind of like casual environment to it, I think is key. I've done a lot of research in Abu Dhabi looking at cross-national interactions, and we see this a lot, that kind of you prime certain cultural, language, religion, these different kind of elements of our culture can dramatically shift how people negotiate, whether they make a first offer negotiation, how friendly they are, even their below the skin stress responses. So these contextual cues in our environments do matter a lot. And I think it's really beautiful that you figure that out and you're like, oh, got to change the context to change the conversation. And I think it's a great example.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, it was completely different when I was going to Latin America, especially Brazil or Mexico, because they were expecting actually going out.
They're like, why aren't we going out?
So the setting was that actually so much. Where one experiment that I did, because I was managing Southeast Asia as a cluster and Latin America as another cluster, was actually tested this over 6-7 years, the speed of agreement among all the teams. Latin America was one common language. It was really an outgoing culture of contribution, and it was co-creation, a lot of co-creation. It was the speed was like impressive. Southeast Asia was more than 12 different languages with so much conflict going on between all these cultures, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. And it was so difficult in so many ways to make much progress, even with the same culture, because we were trying to define the brand and the culture from the same basics. But it was, and my test was, okay, let's see how much we can achieve from one to the other. What is the contrast? Actually doing something that is, it could be similar. It could, for me, one of them was kind of the control group. And that was amazing how just language and understanding make a huge difference between one group and the other group in order to create movement and to create initiatives.
Yeah.
So
I'd love to build on that, Luis, because in that context, when you have a lot of the diversity going on in terms of cultures and languages, what I see then is that the overarching company culture becomes a very important glue. And the rules that you have across country and the onboarding that you have for employees. How do we behave within the context? So almost a third language or a second language, basically. You have your own culture, you have your own language, but then you have your company language. And that becomes if that's dominant, that becomes very important, but that can help as the binding glue between the differences. So there's an opportunity.
absolutely. So why don't we build on that, Jacqui? Because if there is somebody who knows about holistic well-being and the impact that it has on, for example, burnout, is you. So how do we move on? How do we build this concept of holistic well-being where everybody wins?
Yes, well, I'll give a snippet about this, but to make sure that everybody knows that we have an article on this, actually 2 articles also on the business case, and we will share that as well. So what we have seen is that if you have a positive culture, it usually impacts holistic well-being, and you mentioned that term, Luis, which has everything to do. The way we measured it is that we asked questions from employees around the world on their spiritual, social, mental, and physical well-being in terms of functioning. And with spiritual well-being, we mean a sense of meaning or purpose in the being an employee, and the sense of meaning and purpose that you find in life The other ones, I think, may be clear and life, how healthy we feel. And that has a very strong correlation with happiness, very strong correlation. And on the other side, if you have negative cultures, or in particular the holistic, the toxic culture that we just spoke about, that has a huge impact on burnout. It's the number one driver on burnout. The other side of the spectrum. And so if you want to build positive cultures, not only do you need to make sure that you actually take the drivers of the negative culture out of the way to alleviate burnout, you also need to focus on the positive side of building a culture that is inclusive, provides sense of meaning, psychological safety and authenticity, actually that values people for what they are, and also helps people, that's the other topic that we spoke about, helps people to tackle difficulty and challenges, so that you can help take that subjectivity out of it. So if you're in the pressure, so that is another thing that she wanted to mention, because we talked about the role of the leader, and the social events and how it's different in different cultures. If you as a leader can build a culture of trust, so that everybody starts understanding the intention at the bottom line of this team is good. But if you don't, then actually it becomes more toxic. So building trust, which you can do in different ways, is very important. And that links to a topic of psychological safety. So how do you start as an organization? We always say, first, try to understand where you are. What is your baseline? And then look at what you want to achieve. What do you want to be? Who do you want to be as an organization? What do you want to achieve? But if you want to focus on reducing burnout, then it's another story than if you want to build holistic health for employees. And those two can coexist. So that's a study that we did, and we have this article that deep dives into it. Simply trying to tackle burnout with, for example, positive health is not sufficient. So that's why we talked about these topics of toxicity and negative behavior versus positive behaviors.
I'm sure, Tessa, you want to build on this. This is so interesting, right?
Yeah, I think, this idea of trust is key, and how you get there is hard, and it's tough. And I think our intuitions of how to build trust often involve things like we need lots of time to showcase to the person that in tough situations, we're going to have their back, or we're going to promote them behind the scenes. So trust from a social psychological perspective is something that we think of usually as kind of long-term. But I actually think you can get that in the moment if you showcase, if you have a couple key behaviors that indicate that what you say you're going to do, you actually follow through. And you also give people voice in situations where they kind of need a higher status person to do it. And so kind of one of the quickest ways leaders can build trust is actually by echoing the contributions of lower status team members in meetings. And by that, I'll get really concrete. So Jacqui says something. She says we should, work on building trust. And I say, I want to build on what Jacqui said about trust. And I want to make that idea stick. And I want us to kind of build on that as a concept. By doing that, by both calling out the concept, building on it, and giving her credit for that concept, I'm helping her gain status the right way. I'm helping her gain, respect and admiration of everyone else on the team, which is going to help her get ahead. Now, if I was to say, thank you, Jacqui, for sharing that, but I actually want to change topics, that's doing the opposite. On the surface, that feels kind of nice because I'm saying thank you for sharing that, but it's actually a little bit underhanded. It's saying I'm going to now move on. And that's one of the strongest indicators we have of jockeying for status or actually kind of downgrading someone. And so we need to actually showcase to people that we will give them credit and we'll build on their ideas and we'll do the things for them that's going to naturally give them respect and admiration of their coworkers, which is what they need to actually get ahead, and of other leaders. We need to talk about them in context with other leaders when they're not around. We need to be, an ally when it's uncomfortable to be an ally. And so, allyship's a topic we often talk about building trust. I'm not talking like have the company put a big statement about how we love everyone and, put out job ads where we have faces of different races out there. I'm talking like the stuff that no one is watching, that's uncomfortable, and that can actually cost you social capital to do. Sticking up for people, to other leaders when they're being, insulted or their contributions aren't being heard. Having those difficult conversations around how we can actually build people up. And that can feel uncomfortable and costly, but that's how you actually build trust, especially among groups that tend to be disadvantaged, that tend to, not have the hidden curriculum. And so trust is key, but there's little things you can do to actually build it fairly quickly. The main place where people really misstep with building trust is they say privately they're going to they'll do one thing for someone, and then they do something else entirely when that thing becomes uncomfortable or socially costly for them in some way. And so think about what trust actually looks like. It sounds like a great concept, but trust building can feel uncomfortable and it's hard, but it's definitely doable and it doesn't take forever to do. The key is aligning expectations with reality and doing these small things and showcasing these small things. And I think, the other thing I'd say is it's really important for people to get feedback from those who aren't just maybe one step beneath them on the ladder, their own direct reports, but 2 steps beneath them, because those folks often have no one to go to when things aren't going well. And so the leaders who don't, for me, I'm a professor. So, 1 step beneath me is a PhD student, 2 steps would be an undergrad. I routinely have one-on-one meetings with 2 steps beneath with my undergrads to see how things are going with the grad student they're working with the report that's in between, to kind of detect small issues before they come up. And that's how I build trust among those folks, which is really key to getting people to have this kind of holistic well-being. And then I'd say just on top of that, the stress that we feel at work is very much real. It leaks out. I study stress contagion. So I study how the stress I feel is picked up subtly through my nonverbal behaviors of the people in the room, and it impacts their own physiology. So that is very much a real thing. If you have stress, if you have people expressing and feeling those emotions at work, it's not only impacting them, it's impacting the people that they interact with. And often they're completely unaware of that impact. And, they'll feel it down the road. They'll get the burnout, they'll get the disengagement, but that contagion can happen pretty quickly and at a physiologic level. And so that's something that you should also be aware of as you're kind of building these stress. Think about this holistically. How can I also reduce stress contagion? How can I, if someone's stressed out, give them 10 minutes to relax before they come in their room so they don't kind of ooze that stress out and, let the other people around them, especially those high on empathy, really kind of soak it up and absorb it, and it becomes a part of their physiology as well. So those are just a couple ideas of kind of how you can execute on this trust goal, but also while trying to kind of troubleshoot the stress that people are experiencing and its impact on others.
Just listening to you, Tessa, I want to work with you. You don't only know about it. Actually, I feel it. It's like, I think your team must be really, really happy and flourishing with you. So thank you for actually showcasing what it is.
I've had a lot of missteps. I would like to say that in this journey, making mistakes is common. It happens. And I'd also like to say that, we talk about toxicity. All of us have a toxic person who lives within us. We have to know what our Achilles heel is to figure out what it takes to bring that person out. And so I try to be as humble as possible, and I routinely throw myself under the bus when it comes to examples of misstepping or, neglecting and things like that. I think being humble and having an awareness that you can also fall victim to all of these things is really important for people to do. And no one is above that. I don't care how much you know or how much experience you have. We can all definitely kind of fall victim to that under the right circumstances. And so, learning to detect those signs within yourself is also really important.
Yes, we have a whole system. We call these meta pets. These are cards that we use for self-deconstruction and finding our be. They combine the shadow, the essence, and a gift, or basically the key that we can use to get up from the shadow. But basically we know that we all have shadows. We all have those toxicity, and we have to integrate that into our essence. But it's so interesting to acknowledge, and that's why we do what we do, because people don't have awareness about those shadows, about that toxicity. I was a few weeks ago in a YPO, Young Persons Organization in Colombia, and after I spoke about the importance of appreciation, energy, belonging, and basically gratitude at work, he came to me at the end, it was the end of the conference, and he said, well, thank you so much for what you said. Now I understand, really understand why my company is not working, why my
Yeah.
people are leaving, why there is a level of burnout. And I said, what, why, I mean, what is it? What's going on? He said, well, the reason is me.
Oh, yeah.
The reason is me. I'm angry. I cannot manage my emotions.
Hmm.
I'm upset most of the time. And this is what I get back.
Hmm.
So building on this, Jacqui, what do we do? Can we do something when we have leaders such as this one that is like acknowledging that he is upset, he's angry, he's creating a toxic culture, and everybody are victims of this? What can we do?
Yeah.
If we cannot remove that person,
Mhm.
what do we do? Is there a way to manage the culture beyond
Yeah.
the leaders?
Yeah. Wonderful, and it's such a wonderful story, Luis. I think then if you have that situation where you find a leader telling you that, you're in the right spot for change, right? Because that means there's acknowledgement, there's ownership, and potentially the accountability. If you're in that space, you can train leaders on skills that we call that we also explain in the work that I've co-authored with colleagues on adaptability, deliberate calm, and integrative awareness. Sounds a bit abstract, but basically it's what Tessa talked about, emotion regulation and becoming aware. What is actually your role? What is the impact that you have? And what does this mean for you? So not only understanding what's going on around you, but actually another term for that is interoception, starting to learn what's going on in your mind and your body, and as a result, the behavior. And understand a little bit more. You don't need to become a neuroscientist, but if you understand a couple of basic principles, which you can really train, of the impact that biology and environment has on the way you feel and your background and so on, then you can really make a difference. You can change. And we have actually trained leaders at scale. In the work that I've done, we work with leaders in the board to help them understand what is happening in those stressful situations, but then also to give them the tools to change that. And that will actually contribute in becoming better leaders. That will stop the cascade effect as well of bad behavior, but it will also contribute to better health. So, Luis, there is an opportunity for skill building, but there's also a responsibility as leaders to do this, to take this on, and to say, okay, I want to make sure actually that I know where I am, and that's also what Tessa referred to. It takes a journey to make people aware and to really convince them, but once they know, I think you can really start changing it, and so that's a great opportunity. And I want to add, actually, if we zoom out a little bit in the context of the world that we are today, that this is not a nice to have. When unpredictability in the environment changes, and look outside, right? What's happening with the climate, the political environment that we're in, the economic environment, the unpredictability that is increasing very fast in this moment, which has an impact on how people feel. If we don't train our leaders to become adaptable and resilient, and organizations on top of that, then that is going to be hugely challenging if you add on top the layer of Gen AI and the digitalization and so on. So this is, it's not a nice to have, it's an essential need to have.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. We have just a couple of minutes for each of us to wrap up. Before we wrap up, Tessa, I'm really curious about how do we deal with systemic issues? Because this is something that we cannot escape from. I mean, it is what it is. If the system is broken, what can we do? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah. Do you mean systems within organizations? Like, so at the level of the organization,
At the level,
systemic?
but as well Yes, but at the same time, combined with the systemic issues that we are facing today in the world, like, for example, collective anxiety. This
Yeah.
is something that we all are facing. So the collective anxiety is on top of the
Mm-hmm.
systemic issue of the organization. So we have two systems
Yep.
pressing on each other, which is collective anxiety plus the systemic toxicity, or whatever.
Toxicity, it's a weird word, yeah. Yeah, no, I get this question a lot. And it's often framed in terms of, should we talk about politics at work? Yes or no? Go. What should people be allowed to bring to work, what they shouldn't be allowed to bring to work? And I think the answer is, it doesn't matter how I answer this. We bring it all to work. And so the question then is, how do we handle kind of the repercussions of that? I think this is a tricky one for organizations, and people have, we've had this day in school a few times now. We've had lots of missteps around sort of how to handle integrating, world anxiety stressors into the workplace. I'd say, you need a couple policies around how you're going to talk about world issues and life stressors and things like that. I tend to focus less on having the C-suite or top leaders make declarative statements about where they stand, and more again focused on the behaviors that will improve people's daily lives at work. A huge focus on creature comforts in that. So if people are uncomfortable working around certain individuals who maybe have different political or religious beliefs than them, instead of making a declarative statement about which side is right or wrong, or we all need to get along, give people extra workspaces, small things that will increase their creature comforts, will decrease their stress. And I think we often think too big about what those things are. We're often thinking very high level. What's our mission statement? Actually, what people want is a parking spot that they know is going to be there at the same time every day, and that they don't have a 45-minute confidence interval around their commute. What they also want is a reliable coffee machine, coworker who doesn't interrupt them every 15 times, and temperature that stays fairly regular in their office. So those little things can actually do a lot to decrease people's physiologic stress, especially if there are systemic issues in the workplace. And then I think when it comes to actually what those systemic issues are and detecting what those are, you really have to think about the huge communication gap that we know occurs between the people who hire and promote and the people who are on the receiving end of that, employees. In my new book, Job Therapy, in one of the chapters, called The Runner-Up, I'm looking at the reasons why people feel like they're not being promoted. And I ask people who've missed a promotion why they think the reason is. And then I also ask people who grant promotions why they haven't promoted people. Only 7% of people who failed to get promoted were ever told why. And so there are just very clear communication gaps that I think we can just get rid of with just small steps in giving clear, consistent feedback following a failed promotion or raise that will help close these gaps. And then I think sort of the last thing that all organizations can do if you have systemic problems, the first thing you need to think about and evaluate is whether you have procedural fairness in your organization. And what I mean by that is incredibly clear policies about who gets promoted and why, who gets hired and why. And if you have reasons seeping into that decision-making process that are, hidden from view, they are not made clear to the employees that are affecting them, are based on illegitimate cues like nepotism, knowing the boss, things like that, everything else falls apart. And so, having clear policies around hiring, promotion, raises, who's on what team, who's handed what, that are public, these things shouldn't be hidden from you. These are things that all employees should have knowledge of. And every decision the leader makes should be able to back up their decision following these procedures. Once procedural fairness is gone, everything else falls apart. Trust erodes. People start cheating. They start, kissing up and kicking down. And so a lot of these kind of like holes in the boat can be plugged if we just address transparency, procedural fairness, clarity around who's making decisions and why, and then we have policies that are behavior-based around how we're going to incorporate those world stressors, how we're going to think about those in the workplace. Putting blinders on, putting your head in the sand isn't a solution. Making declarative statements about whose side you're on isn't the solution. Small behavioral actions that increase people's comfort at work, are part of the solution. And these are things that all employees can get on board with. And from a DE&I perspective, it creates inclusivity. And what you don't want to do when you create these inclusive practices is inadvertently actually kind of distance other groups that don't feel included. And so think about these practices very holistically. They should be able to benefit everyone. Put yourself through a litmus test. If I do X, is it going to offend any groups of people here? And if the answer is Y, then don't do X. Think of something else you can do that should increase the well-being for everyone. And so I think this is a very difficult question, but there are little things organizations can do and pretty straightforward things they can do to increase people's well-being, and they're not going to solve the world's problems. And so, talking about them over and over again, I'd say I would decrease that. One little last piece of advice I want to give is there's a bunch of new data out on who actually wants to be talking about politics and things like that at work. Most people are doing it. Most people actually don't want to be doing it. And so there's often kind of a silent majority in organizations who feel one way but don't feel comfortable expressing that. This isn't to say that's what that is for every organization, but I think for leaders, you don't want to rely too much on minority voice, the loudest people in the room who are demanding that you do X, Y, Z. You need to get a sense of what that silent majority is, what people are feeling that they don't feel comfortable expressing, and use some of those tools Jacqui talked about of how to actually detect those things within your organization before you make any moves. Yeah, that's it. I'm done.
You're
Come
well,
on.
wisely done. So kissing up and kicking down, we don't want that.
Yeah, that's right.
Jacqui, how do you want to wrap up this amazing roundtable?
Yeah, it's as an introvert, there's a lot of many ideas going through my mind, and there's so much said. I think one thing comes to mind: with the right intention, a lot of great stuff can be done. And the one thing's for sure, there is a lot that can be done, but it's a huge cake, and there are many things that can be done. And how do you prioritize? But there's for sure a lot that can be done, and I guess the key message, the common theme here is that we discussed today is a lot has to do with skills and learning and development and enabling your people and looking at the systems. How do we actually integrate these topics within the way of working? But for sure, there is a lot that can be done, and that is the positive message. And I would also, because I like avoiding negative positivity, but I like to look at the positive message, right? We often talk about the negative side and the downside of work, but I would love to put a spotlight also on the positive side of work in all of this, because it brings support, it brings social cohesion. And my last thought would actually for today is this notion that we talk a lot about in my team at McKinsey Health Institute is, if you create healthy workplaces, you create healthy employees, but also healthy organizations and healthy societies. And that notion of what is it for my organization, or what is it for everyone on the call or who listens to this later, what is the couple of things that you can do to contribute to that, to build a better and a more happier world, but also a healthier world, because there's a lot that is not going well in the world, and if we focus on enabling the positivity, then hopefully we can contribute in a positive way as well. It was lovely to listen to the conversation, and I have a lot of food for thought as well on my side. I like, Tessa, your humility. You said, and I acknowledge that, because it's a trial and error. Maybe that's the last thought. It's an ongoing journey. So if you make a step back, you can make a few steps forward, but keep going.
Yeah. Missteps are common. They're a normal, natural part of the process. Don't feel discouraged if you execute on the things we talked about and you feel like maybe you didn't quite do it perfectly. That happens to everyone. And I think we live in a world now where everyone's constantly, kind of managing their own reputation on social media. But underneath all that is a lot of mistakes. So I feel like it's fine to have those. It's a natural part of the process. We've all made them, I'm sure.
There's a lot of data on that. So never think that anybody is perfect. It doesn't exist, right?
No one's perfect. There are no perfect people. That is right.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Tessa West and Jacqui Brassey, for being here, for bringing us so much wisdom and so many insights in this day that is International Day of Happiness. We want this day to be every day. of course. And something else we want as well, people to be aware that they might be making other people's life toxic or miserable. So I think that this is very important, is the balance of happiness and unhappiness, is the balance of well-being or not too well-being. So I think that this is key for all of us. This is why we celebrate this day, why we want this day to be every day. And I really say thank you for your wisdom and your insights, Tessa and Jacqui. And let's keep the journey ahead, because this is a journey, as you said, and let's keep the conversation. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights.
Thanks for having us. And, go out there and be happy and enjoy life, everyone. And yeah, I love the journey. I think that that's just a really important, it's going to be up and down, but happiness isn't always about feeling good. It's reflecting, figuring out what you can do to improve, and then having those open conversations with other people around the same thing. So thank you for having me. This was amazing.
Well, thank you everybody for joining the session, and everybody who's watching this. Jacqui, last words.
Massive thanks. Wonderful to collaborate with you all. And thank you everybody for joining and listening, and have a wonderful World Happiness Day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.